was raised in a very dysfunctional home. Growing up, my father was an alcoholic. My mom did what she could to keep peace in the home and to make ends meet, but it wasn't always successful. I can remember many times my dad being drunk, my mom trying to keep him calm. And looking back, I realized it was even more dysfunctional than I knew it was at the time. I knew that my dad loved me. I knew that my dad cared for me, and I knew that my mom loved me. That was never the issue. But I did see a side of my dad when I was growing up that was not very positive. It was very sad. It was very emotional at times. I know that life is full of defining moments. And even growing up in a dysfunctional home, I can't really point to one moment that stands out above another in that setting, but I'll never forget when I was 10 years old, when I discovered something that I didn't know existed. I was at my grandmother's house, and my grandmother always kept important papers for some reason underneath her couch cushions. And so one day at 10 years old, I was just rummaging through those couch cushions, and I found an envelope. So I thought I'd open it up and see what was in it. And when I opened it up, I found my birth certificate. The only problem was the father who was listed on the birth certificate was not the man who was raising me. And my last name was not Mitchell, but instead on the birth certificate, my name was Richard Eric Jackson. So at the age of 10, I realized that the man who was raising me was not my father. I knew my father to be James Mitchell, but yet on my birth certificate, my father's name was Ronnie Jackson. So at the age of 10, I started developing questions in my mind of who is my dad? Who is my father? Who is this Ronnie Jackson? And I didn't know who he was. Just like every kid, you long to know who your father is. And I finally got to meet Ronnie when I was about 14 years old. It was the summer between my freshman and sophomore years of high school. And Ronnie came to my grandmother's house, and we struck up a conversation while he was there and got to know each other just a little bit. It was really awkward because here was my biological father sitting in front of me, but yet we had nothing in common. I didn't know anything about him, and I don't know how much he knew about me. But yet we decided the next day we were going to go to lunch. And so as a 14-year-old kid, I was excited. I was like, man, this is my biological father. I finally get to meet him. And the next day he came to pick me up, and we went to lunch and took me to a really nice lunch. And as we were eating, he started telling me that he was leaving on a business trip the next day. But when he got back into town, he wanted to come. He wanted to pick me up, bring me to his house, because he wanted me to meet his wife, my stepmom. And he also wanted me to meet my two half-brothers. And so I was really excited about that. Again, I was 14 at the time. I'm now 50 years old. It's been 36 years since I've ever seen Ronnie Jackson again. I felt unwanted. I just felt alone in a sense, because not only did Ronnie not want to have anything to do with me at that point, or at least that's the way I felt, but my mom and dad had divorced. My dad's drinking had escalated, and their relationship just couldn't last. And so those were defining moments in my life, and it was very difficult. And it set off a chain of events as I look back through my life that made me realize how dysfunctional my life really was. And how, if we're not careful, we can turn defining moments into monuments. And we can allow those moments in our life to become bigger than they really are. I remember going through life just as a teenager, and my dad, James Mitchell, the man who raised me, the man who I knew was my father. I remember growing up and seeing him drunk on many occasions. And his drinking escalated to the point where him and my mom's relationship could not last, and they ended up divorcing. And I was being raised by a single mom with a brother and a younger brother and a younger sister. And my mom did everything she could to make ends meet, and she worked her tail off. And my mom's a great lady, and she did everything she could for us. So when my dad was drinking a lot, I was playing football. I was in 6th grade. And I'll never forget, I was at football practice one day, and my coach, Bernard Meigel, invited me to come to a youth event at their church. He had 2 boys that were around my age. Brian was a little bit older, and Kurt was a year younger, and they invited me to come to church with them. And I'll never forget walking into this church and seeing what I thought would look like probably 1,000 teenagers at this meeting. And they were all excited, and it was fun. And I'll never forget walking in there and feeling like, man, this is awesome. So they invited me to church. We started going. Our family started going to church after my parents had divorced. And it was just a place that I really found a connection, a place that I found friendship, people who really cared about me. So we started going to church, and before long, even though my parents were divorced, my dad started coming to church as well. And I'll never forget the day that my dad turned his life around. Things changed in his life. And for the next 9 months, my dad served God with everything that was in him. He was passionate about Jesus. Our family was growing closer, and seemed like the dysfunction was leaving. And we were becoming a functional family, a positive, healthy family. And then one day my dad lost his job. And the day he lost his job is when he started drinking again. After seeing him sober for 9 months, it was really heartbreaking to see him drinking again. And this time his drinking just increased and got to the point again where him and my mom's relationship could not last. And so they divorced again. Here I am, I'm about 14, 15 years old, still going to church. We're still getting involved and still doing things. And we went to Trinity Baptist Church in Pasadena, Texas. And I'll never forget it. Every summer we had a youth camp that we went to, but we also had a youth choir tour. Now, to hear me sing today, you would never think I would ever be in a youth choir, but I actually was. And so we were on a youth choir tour the summer that I turned 15. And I'll never forget, we were at a church and we were singing, and that night I remember distinctly the Lord impressed upon me that He was calling me, Rick Mitchell, He was calling me to preach the gospel, to preach His word. And at the age of 15, I didn't really know what I was getting myself into, but I said, God, if this is what you're calling me to do, I'm going to say yes. I'm going to do it. So that night I made a commitment that I was going to give my life to do what God was asking me to do. We came home from that choir tour, and we went back to Trinity Baptist Church, and our pastor, at the end of every service, he would always give an altar call, and he would preach, and he would give an altar call and come and stand down front and ask for people who wanted to give their hearts to Christ or wanted to join the church to come down and to meet him and pray with him. And that day, I left my seat and I walked down and I told him, Pastor Ansley, I feel like God is calling me to preach the gospel. A few weeks later, maybe a few months later, he had asked me and another young man, another kid who was 15 years old, to preach on a Wednesday night. Well, I didn't know much about preaching at the time, but I did know you needed a suit and you needed a Bible. And so my grandparents went and bought me a suit, and then they went and we got me a Bible. We got me a Thompson Chain Reference Bible. Because at the time, that's the kind of Bible that my pastor used, and we just knew that was the kind of Bibles that preachers used. It was a study Bible, and it was a popular Bible at the time, so that's what we got. I had my name imprinted on it, Ricky Mitchell. And so that was my first preaching Bible. I was so excited to have it. And I'll never forget preaching my first sermon. I was 15 years old. I was scared to death. And I preached my first sermon at the age of 15, and it lasted 15 minutes. Now I can preach an hour, it feels like 15 minutes, but back then, I preached 15 minutes and it felt like an hour. I remember going to tell my dad that I'd surrendered to the ministry. I'd surrendered to preach the gospel. My dad was living at my grandparents', his parents' house at the time, and him and my mom were divorced, and so we would drive down to visit him, to see him. And I'll never forget walking back to the car and him walking us back outside, and he had been drinking. And I'll never forget telling my dad, "Dad, I want you to know something, that I've surrendered my life to preach the gospel." And my dad began to cry. And I'll never forget standing in the driveway that day with my dad. And even through his alcohol issues, he was still proud of me. And he looked at me with tears in his eyes. And he told me he was proud of me. And he made a statement that I've never forgotten. I said, "Dad, I've surrendered to preach the gospel." And he looked at me and he said, "That's my boy." And he gave me a big hug. I'll never forget that day as long as I live. Man, I served God all through high school. I led our Bible club at our high school. I led Fellowship of Christian Athletes. I was very involved in our church. Our church ran about 10 or 12 buses every weekend to go pick up people and kids for church. And I was a bus captain and would lead the teams to go visit the apartment complexes around Pasadena, my route on Saturdays. And then we'd go back Sundays and pick people up. We'd bring them to church, and I'd get to preach in children's church and see kids come to Christ. Man, I was so excited, and man, things were great. And all through high school, like I said, I served God. One of my passions was basketball. I had an offer to go play college basketball at Jacksonville Baptist College. And I was really excited to go get to play here. My mom had remarried, and her new husband, my stepdad, Kenneth, had played college basketball at Jacksonville Baptist. And man, I was going to go play there, and things were going to be exciting and good. And so I drove up there for a weekend just to look at the campus and to look at their program. And the weekend that I went, I remember getting a newspaper and looking in the newspaper, and as I'm reading through the Jacksonville newspaper, I get to the sports section. And when I get to the sports section, I see a picture of two guys who I didn't know, but the headline said, "Jacksonville Baptist signs 2 guards from New York." So I saw the writing on the wall and knew that if I went to Jacksonville Baptist, I wasn't going to play. So I decided that day, I'm not going to go play basketball at Jacksonville Baptist. And at that moment, I remember feeling very discouraged. And I remember feeling like, wow, what do I do now? I didn't know what to do next, because that was what I was going to do. It was always my dream to play college basketball, and now it seemed like that dream had been snatched out from under me. So I finished my senior year, and the summer between my senior year and my first year in college, I started kind of falling off the wagon, if you will. My commitment to serving God was not where it needed to be. And I remember somebody offered me a drink, and I'd never had a drink of alcohol before then, and I really despised alcohol because I saw what it had done to my dad, and I never wanted to drink. I never wanted to be a part of that, but I was at a low point in my life, and somebody said, "Here, just have this drink," and I took a drink, and that one drink led to 2, and then 3, and then 4, and before you know it, I was drinking a lot, and my life was really spiraling out of control. I enrolled at San Jacinto Junior College in Pasadena, Texas for my first year of college. I didn't know what I was wanting to do. I had no idea what my career path was, but I knew if I was going to do anything, I probably needed to go to school. So I enrolled for either 12 or 15 hours my first semester of college. Well, like I said, my life was spiraling out of control, and college became very low on my list of priorities. I really just wanted to party. I wanted to drink more than I wanted to do anything. So I enrolled in that first semester of college, and after one semester, I dropped every class but one, and that was my basketball class. So I went back the second semester. I re-enrolled again for another 12 or 15 hours, ended up doing the same thing again. So after 1 year of college, I had 2 credit hours to my name: golf and basketball. I went from leading Bible studies in high school to being the life of the party a year later. And after drinking, I remember we were at a party and somebody offered me some marijuana, and I began to say, yeah, let's try that. And so I began to smoke weed, and I dropped out of school. After I dropped out of college, I started working at a place called AutoZone, and it was there that I was hanging around people who were drinking all the time and partying. That's all they wanted to do, and I just immersed myself in that type of environment and in that type of lifestyle. I couldn't believe that I was headed in that direction, but there I found myself. And I remember meeting this girl, and she became my girlfriend at the time, and she was very instrumental in getting me a different job. And so I started working. I started working at a pawn shop in the Houston area, and we were up there late at night. And I remember one of the guys I worked with, we would stay late just to be with this guy so he wouldn't be by himself. We just wanted to make sure everything was cool. And so I remember one night this guy I worked with, we were just hanging out one night. He said, hey, it's getting kind of late. What do you want to do? You want to go get something to eat? You want to shoot some pool? You want to do some coke? What do you want to do? And I remember thinking to myself, well, I've eaten and I've shot pool, but I've never done coke. So hey, let's do some coke. And so that night, I snorted my first line of cocaine. Cocaine quickly replaced marijuana as my drug of choice. I became addicted very fast. I had gone from leading Bible studies to drinking to doing drugs, and now here I am doing coke. I remember there were times just driving down the freeways of Houston, I would have my little marble block laid out on the console in my car, and I would be cutting a line of coke as I'm driving with my left hand. Then when we would stop, I would kind of look around to make sure nobody's watching. I would take my gold straw and I would snort those lines of coke, and not only putting myself in danger, but I'm sure many people around me. One day I was working at the pawn shop, and I got a phone call. And somebody said, hey, Rick, there's a guy on the phone for you. And so I answered the phone, and it was Ronnie. Ronnie Jackson was calling me. And I was kind of dumbfounded. I'm like, you hadn't talked to me since my lunch with you when I was 14, and now here you are calling me. What do you want? And he made the comment. He said, hey, I heard you've dropped out of school. And I said, yeah, I have. And he said, well, I want you to go back to school and I want to pay for it. And I'm like, Ronnie, I'm not really interested in going back to school right now. So I kind of brushed him off, and he told me this. He said, whenever you get ready to go back, you let me know and I'll pay for it. And I said, you got it. I had no intentions of ever going back to school. I had no desire to go to college at that point. My life consisted of drinking and snorting coke and working. And that's all I wanted to. I wanted to live the life of a partier, and that's all that mattered to me. College was nowhere in the equation. So I just kept working, kept partying, kept doing my thing. Then a few months later, I get another phone call at work. This was in the days when cell phones were brand new, and I had the Zach Morris cell phone, you know, the tall one with the long antenna, and I would carry it in my back pocket. And somehow somebody, this guy who was calling me had gotten my cell phone number, and so I answered my cell phone, and on the other end was a guy named Terry Bryan. Terry Bryan was the basketball coach at Southwestern Assemblies of God University in Waxahachie, Texas. At the time, I didn't know how he got my number, and he said, Rick, I've heard about you. And I was like, I don't know how you've heard about me, because I don't even know who you are. And then he mentioned the name of a guy named Alan Neal. And Alan was a guy that I had grown up with playing church league basketball. He was a little bit older, but we had known each other from church functions and church basketball leagues and different things. And Alan had gone to Southwestern to play basketball. And he had told Terry Bryan, he said, Terry, there is a guy in Pasadena that you need to call. He's a point guard, and you need to get him up here to play for us. So Terry Bryan took his word on it. And Terry Bryan called me and offered me an opportunity to come play basketball at Southwestern Assemblies of God College in Waxahachie, Texas. So in January of 1989, I loaded up my Mustang with everything I knew I needed to take, and I drove and I moved to Waxahachie, Texas to attend Southwestern Assemblies of God College to play college basketball. I also took some Coke with me as well, because I couldn't do without that. I left everything behind to go play basketball. I showed up in January of 1989 and get there, and lo and behold, I find a couple of guys who were interested in partying just like me. Not everybody on that team was living for God at the time, and we connect, we start hanging out, and we become good friends, and we decide, man, that we're just gonna keep to ourselves, and we're gonna do what we do. We're gonna party, we're gonna drink, we're gonna do whatever we need to do. We're gonna try to keep it on the down low so nobody knows, nobody hears about it. There were these two girls. One was named Terry and one was named Tori. And when we met these two girls, man, we just hit it off as friends. And Paul and Tori started dating, and Terry had a boyfriend that went to another college, and I had a girlfriend back home, and so Tori and Paul were together. Me and Terry were just kind of like the sidekicks, I guess you could say, so Paul and Tori were going out, and Tori would always come to me and say, hey, why does he treat me this way? Why does he do this? Why does he act like this? And so Tori and I became really, really close friends. We became really, really good friends. And finally, her and Paul broke up. And I remember one weekend Tori's from Amarillo, and we decided we're going to go to Amarillo one weekend just to visit her parents. She hadn't been home in a while, so we took off from Waxahachie and made about the 7 or 8 hour drive to Amarillo. And we were coming back home, back to Waxahachie. This was probably in April of 1989, and so I'd been at school since January and had been drinking and partying, still doing my thing, and not interested in, I'd go to chapel every day, but really it was just to get a nap, and I didn't really care about chapel. I didn't care about the Bible studies we did. I didn't care about any of that. I was there to play basketball. So as we're driving back home from Waxahachie, Tori and I started talking about Bibles. And so she looked at me, and she knew the lifestyle I was living, and she knew that I wasn't serving God, and she knew all these things. And when she looked at me, we were talking about Bibles, and she made this comment. She said, I bet you don't even own a Bible. And I looked at her, I said, yes, I do. I said, I have a Thompson Chain Reference Bible. And she looked back at me and she said, that's the kind of Bibles preachers use. And it was at that moment, in her Camaro, driving through Dallas, that I began to tell her that at the age of 15, I was called to the ministry. At the age of 15, I preached my first sermon. I began to break. And I think her jaw was literally laying on the ground because she was shocked, because the Rick she knew was not the Rick that I was in high school. So all she knew was the partying Rick. All she knew was the drinking Rick. All she knew was the drugging Rick. But yet she didn't know that God had called me to the ministry when I was 15. So that started a relationship with Tori and I. We started to date. We started to develop this really close relationship. And I felt like I could tell her anything. And I would just pour everything out to her, and I would tell her everything that was on my heart, everything I was feeling, everything, all the emotions that were going on. And I remember when I first went to school at Southwestern, I remember calling my mom and saying, Mom, you remember Ronnie? I told you that Ronnie said he'd pay for my school if I would go back. And she said, yeah. And I said, I want you to call him and let him know that I'm back in school. And so she called him and she said, hey, Rick's back in school. He said, well, let us know how much it is and I'll get you a check. And so I got all that information, sent it to my mom, and she got that information to Ronnie, and they had, Ronnie said he was going to get us a check, no problem. And I remember that the day that he was supposed to get the check to us, my mom and him had set up a time to meet. And my mom said she would call me whenever she got the money, and we'd figure out a way where I could get it from her. And so we made those arrangements. So that day came, and I never heard from my mom. And later in the day, I never heard from her. And then that night, didn't hear from her again. And Tori and I and some friends, we'd gone to the movie, and so I remember leaving the movie theater that night and just stepping out into the foyer and going to the payphone and making a phone call and calling my mom. I had to call her Colette because I was a college kid, didn't have any money. And I called her and I said, Mom, tell me what's going on. Did you get the money? And she said, no, we didn't get the money. And I was like, what do you mean you didn't get the money? And she told me, she said, Rick, when I called Ronnie today to set up the time and the place to meet to get the money, he asked me to do something I couldn't do. I said, okay, what did he ask you to do? And Ronnie had asked my mom to leave her husband, to leave Kenneth. And he would leave his wife. And he would get back together with her. And if she was not willing to do that, then he wasn't going to give us the money. And my mom told him that she could not do that. She was not willing to leave her husband to get back with him. And then he told my mom, he said, then as far as I'm concerned, when I hang up this phone, I've never known you and I've never known Rick. I took on a whole new level of hurt, a whole new level of anger, a whole new realm of unforgiveness toward Ronnie that I hadn't had before. Before it was like, if he don't want to have anything to do with me, that's fine or whatever. But this pushed it to a whole nother level. And I carried pain and resentment and unforgiveness toward him for years. Fast forward just a few months, and Tori and I's relationship is going well. We end up getting engaged, and we get married in May of 1990. And man, it's been 27 great years. At least for me it has. You may ask her, she may give you a different opinion, but I think we've had 27 great years. And but that doesn't mean that life isn't full of hurts, and life isn't full of just things that happen, because life happens to all of us. But it's how we deal with those things that happen to us. It's how we respond to those things that determine how our life turns out. How our life is lived. I remember we had our first church. We were youth pastors at Lindell, Texas, at First Assembly of God. Pastor Gary Oglesby, one of my spiritual fathers. And we had gone there just for the summer, right after we got married. In fact, they interviewed us before we were married, and they asked, when are you getting married? And we said August. And they said, could you move it up? And so we moved it from August to May. We had a small wedding. We got married on a Saturday, and did our first youth service the next Wednesday. We were all excited about getting to this church and getting started, about being in the ministry and being youth pastors. Man, we thought all church people were nice. And then we got into ministry and realized that, wow, that's not really true. We get to this church, and they had a couple that was working with students at the time, and they had agreed to, when we come in, that they would work with us. We'd work together, and man, we would help this youth group. And we had just committed for the summer. That's all they had committed to us, and that's all we had committed to them. And then after we get there for that summer, again, we had been married less than a week. And we do our first youth service, and soon after that, the couple who had agreed to work with us decided they didn't want to work with us. And they decided to start causing trouble for us and with our pastor, and stirring up trouble within the church. We made it through the summer. I don't really know how, but we made it through the summer. And we got to August, and the pastor and the board had met and asked if we wanted to, if we would consider staying on the rest for another year, staying on, coming on full time. And we said, yeah, we would consider that. And so in the board meeting, all the board members voted unanimously for that to happen. They said, yes, we will vote. We want that to happen. So then they had to take it before the church in order just to ratify their vote and say, listen, this isn't a vote on whether or not they're staying, but this is a vote just to let you know this is what we have decided as a board, and we just want your vote of confirmation. We just want you to know that, we just want to know that you're behind us. And so during this whole time, this couple who had agreed to work with us then had decided they didn't want to. had gone and started politicking with other people in the church and stirring up more trouble and dissension. And I'll never forget being at the business meeting that night at church. And I don't think the church was split 50-50, but it was pretty obvious who was for us and who was against us, even before the vote took place. So when it came to the part of the business meeting, they were going to talk about us. They had us leave. So we walked out into the foyer where the office was. There's a big plate glass window there where we sat in the office and we just waited. And I don't remember how long we waited. It seemed like an eternity, but we waited and we waited and we waited. And nobody ever came out. We couldn't hear what was being discussed. But then all of a sudden, the first person came out of the doors of the church, of the sanctuary. And when they did, they slammed the door so hard behind them that it flung right back open. I remember seeing this couple we knew who were for us, sitting on the back wall in a chair next to the back wall of the sanctuary with their face in their hands crying. And we knew it wasn't good. So in the meantime, a friend of mine that was an evangelist, he was in town, and so I called him and said, "Hey, can I meet with you?" And I told him the situation that was going on. And he gave me probably the best piece of advice I'd ever been given. And probably still to this day, one of the best pieces of advice I've ever been given. He looked at me and he said, "You have a choice." He said, "You can either become bitter or you can become better. But it's your choice." And my wife and I made a choice that day to become better. We weren't going to let bitterness rule in our hearts. We were not going to let pain hold us back. And we decided to stay at that church. And after 5 years, we felt God calling us to come to Lubbock, Texas to start a church. And so we moved to Lubbock, Texas, and we planted a church called Third Day Fellowship. We started in our home. And I remember I went from preaching in churches from hundreds to thousands to preaching in my living room to 10 or 12 people sitting in a chair in front of my fireplace. And yeah, it was culture shock, but yet we knew this is what God had called us to do. We found a building that we needed to renovate, so we leased it, we renovated, we got it up and running, and our church was going really well. And then all of a sudden people just started leaving. Nobody was mad, nobody was angry, nobody was upset at us. They just felt like it was time for them to move on. And so all of a sudden our church went into decline, and it was not going as well as it used to go. It wasn't going as well as we had hoped for. And after 4.5 years of pastoring Third Day Fellowship, we finally made the decision that we needed to close the doors. We could have kept going and kept meeting with the few people that we had, but it really wasn't doing them any good. It wasn't doing us any good. We were spiritually and emotionally empty. But most of all, we knew it wasn't doing the kingdom of God any good. We were just kind of going through the motions because that's what as pastor, you have to go to church on Sunday. And I'll never forget sitting down with some people who attended our church and sitting there telling them that we're going to resign and we're going to close the doors to the church. I remember feeling like such a failure. I remember feeling like I'd failed God. I'd failed all the people who had come to Third Day Fellowship. I felt like I'd failed my family. I'd failed everyone who had invested financially into our life. I felt like I'd failed God, that I was unusable, that God was done with me. And it's not that I didn't love God anymore, and I wasn't mad at God, but I just felt like I had disappointed Him and I had failed Him. Year 2, not in ministry, and so I would kind of start preaching every now and then. I would go to different places that preach. There were a couple of opportunities to preach in the youth group at Church on the Rock, and so few doors started opening, and so year 2 passes by and we get into year 3 of not being in full-time ministry, which is all we had known since we'd been married. And I was like, "Okay, God, I'm ready. I'm ready, God." The problem is when we're ready, or when we think we're ready, it's not necessarily when we're ready. God has other plans and other ideas. And I remember I became very, very frustrated. And I was like, God, you've got to do something. You've got to do something here, God, because I'm frustrated. And I went to work every day, and I wasn't frustrated with my boss. I wasn't frustrated with my job. I was frustrated because I wasn't doing what I was created to do. I was called. I was created to preach the gospel. It was a burning passion in my heart to be in ministry. It's how God formed me and how God made me, but yet I wasn't getting to do it. And I remember on a Wednesday night, we were at church. Pastor Jackie was teaching on prayer and hearing the voice of God. And he said, I want you to get alone in the sanctuary, and I want you to just you and God talk. So people started spreading out, and I found my own place, and I got on my face on the carpet, and I said, God, I need a word from you. I need something from you to sustain me, and I need something from you, God, that's going to give me hope. And that night I heard the Lord speak to me, and what he said was this. He said, there's an opportunity coming that you know nothing about. And that's all he told me. But it gave me hope, and I wrote it down. And I kept it, and I would read it, and I would hold on to it. But more than having it on paper, I had it in my heart and I had it in my mind. So, I don't know, a few weeks, a few months passed. I still had that word. It gave me hope. And I'll never forget getting a call one day from Pastor Jansen. He's the executive pastor at Church on the Rock. And he called and asked if we could do lunch. And so we went to lunch, and we had started talking about Church on the Rock and about my life and my ministry and things. And so I just told him one day, I said, hey, if there's ever an opportunity for me to come on staff, I'd love to be considered. And so we had lunch that day and went on our way. And a few weeks later, he called me again and said, hey, let's have lunch. So I went to have lunch with him again. And as we were having lunch, he said, hey, do you have a few minutes after we're done to come back to the church? So we get into Pastor Jackie's office, and we make small talk there just to say hi and whatever. And then Pastor Jackie looks at me and says, hey, there's an opportunity we want to talk to you about. And I'll never forget that word that the Lord gave me a few months earlier, that there's an opportunity coming you know nothing about. And as we're sitting in an office, and he says, opportunity, that word just jumped in my spirit. And now for 5.5 years, I've been serving on staff at Church on the Rock. I've done a lot of things. Now I'm living my destiny. I'm living my dream. The future is bright. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know what the future looks like. But there is a message that I've adopted for my life. It's very simple, that your destiny is greater than your history. And I believe that with all my heart, that no matter where you've been or no matter what you've done, that God has spoken destiny over us. And God has put destiny inside of us. And that no matter what your history says, your destiny says something else. No matter how black or how dark your history is, your destiny is brighter. I know for me, looking back, man, when I turned my back on God, when I went from serving God to doing drugs, and God opened this huge door to go to Southwestern to get my life turned around. I'll never forget that. I'll never forget those days. I'll never forget from feeling like a failure when our church closed to now getting to be part of a successful church that's doing great things. I truly believe the message that our destiny is greater than our history. And I don't know where you've been. I don't know what you're going through right now. But I do know this, that God has something better for you. God has something greater for you. Don't let your history hold you back. Don't let a defining moment define who you are. But instead, let God define the moment for you. Maybe you have failed. Maybe you didn't succeed. Maybe things haven't gone your way, but that doesn't change the way God feels about you, and it doesn't change His plan for your life. So I just want to sum all this up by telling you this, that God loves you. And He's got a great plan for your life. Don't settle for mediocrity when God says you can be great. Don't settle for history when God says you have a destiny.